Great. Well, thanks very much for including me in this symposium. Yeah, it's really great to be here. And as you heard, I'm going to tell you about our work detecting COVID using wearables. I should have plenty of time for questions at the end. I don't think we'll take 25 minutes. So obviously this is pretty familiar to you. We're in a pandemic with multiple waves going through, and somewhat reassuringly, the numbers are decreasing. But if you think about it, we're still at 60,000 cases a day, which is pretty high. It's almost as high as we were last summer. And obviously in Europe, it's surging quite high. So certainly the way people are trying to identify this now is, at least the gold standard is PCR antigen testing is now out there. One problem with this test is that it's relatively slow, meaning you'll get sampled one day and get your results the next day. Sometimes it can take several days depending where you are in the country. The price is dropping, so it's probably less than $100 a test, but it's still not dirt cheap. And the biggest problem, of course, is you don't get tested every day unless you're an NBA player. So you really may have a lag between when you first get ill and get infected and when it actually appears. So what we think is that wearables have a potential in this space to be able to do early detection. And you may or may not know, but wearable devices, mostly dominated by smartwatches, are really becoming quite prevalent. 20% of the US population, 50 million people, are actively wearing smartwatches. I'm not sure how many in this audience are. What's powerful about them is they make hundreds of thousands of measurements a day. Some devices even make millions of measurements a day, and they're measuring you 24/7. And it depends upon the device, but they typically measure, smartwatches will anyway, heart rate variability, respiration rate can be derived. Some of the devices do blood oxygen, skin temperature, and blood pressure. So all these different physiological measurements can get picked up by smartwatches and other devices like rings and such. And so the way people typically use these is they figure out their pattern. At least this is how we're using them. You figure out your both daily and weekly, and to be honest, you can seasonal patterns you can all derive from data. Just to give you an example, this is my circadian pattern. So sleep up top, heart rate, skin temperature. So sleep at night, wake during the day, occasional nap, back to sleep at night. Heart rate's low, goes higher, back down. Skin temperature for most people is high at night, drops in the day, goes back up. So you can figure out people's daily patterns. And then later, as you'll see, the goal is really to understand what's going on and then find deviations from those patterns. So the way we got into using these stems from our deep profiling. Some of you may be familiar with. We started this actually about 11 years ago of doing something called personal omics profiling, where we would measure people very, very deeply with various omics technologies. So we'd sequence their DNA once, their genome once, but we'd pick up, follow their epigenome in its most select form, actually 14 different omes, transcriptome, proteome, etc. And as we were doing these measurements, so two aspects of the study. One is this deep data collection on folks, and the other is the longitudinal nature. So we actually sample people. There's a healthy cohort, 109 people we've been following now for about 8 years, some a little longer, some a little less. But in addition to doing deep sampling, it's longitudinal. So we'll follow people when they're healthy every 3 months. And then when a viral infection or something like that comes along, we'll actually take many, many more samplings, usually 5 to 7, to see what's going on. And really the goal out of all this is to try and understand what it means to be healthy, how does that track over time, how does these profiles differ from one person to the next. And a big part of all this was to really try to see if these advanced technologies could be useful for potentially managing people's health. Now, while we were doing this, we realized that, these fitness trackers came out, and about 7 or 8 years ago, before the Apple Watch, we said, well, these are not just fitness trackers, they're pretty powerful physiological monitors for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So we put these on our cohort, and then in addition to the omics profiling, followed this. And from, by the way, this profiling, we wound up coming up with 49 major health discoveries, and it's a wide range of areas. So heme-oncology, cardiovascular, metabolic. Some of these were a pretty big deal. We caught someone with early lymphoma, 2 people with serious heart issues and things like that. And it turns out the wearables were actually pretty powerful. They were only on for a short period of time when we'd done this. Is about 3.5 years of profiling, and the wearables had been on for probably about a year or less. We did catch some with AFib, another one with sleep apnea. And here's what got us into the infectious disease space. We actually caught my Lyme disease on one of the participants using a simple smartwatch and a pulse ox. And so the backstory here was I was helping my brother put up fences in rural Massachusetts, where 55% of ticks are Lyme infested. And then 2 weeks later, I was flying to Norway. And you may or may not know, but your blood oxygen drops on airplanes. But and I measure myself all the time. You probably figured out. In fact, I have 4 smartwatches and I was wearing a pulse ox at the time. And I noticed that my blood oxygen was abnormally low on a flight like this is from Frankfurt to Oslo. But normally my blood oxygen would be about 96, but it dropped to 90 median on that flight and never came back to normal. It stayed down. I also noticed my heart rate was up. This was plotted at low resolution. And I later learned my skin temperature was elevated. So I went to a physician. I later got a low-grade fever after noticing these physiological changes. So I went, got a low-grade fever. I went to a physician in Norway, and he pulled blood, said monocytes are up. Yep, got a bacterial infection. You should take penicillin. I said, no, I should take doxycycline. Had a little bit of a standoff there. And in the end, he did give me doxycycline, which I took, and it cleared it up right away. You take it for 2 weeks, I'm sure you know. And when I got back, I got tested, and sure enough, I was Lyme positive. It's a very well-controlled experiment because 3 days before I'd left, I'd actually given blood, and we tested that. I was Lyme negative. So I seroconverted, even had a few antigens left at this time. But the point out of all this is that I was able to pick up my Lyme disease from a simple smartwatch and a pulse ox, and these very simple measurements. So that prompted us to look at the data we had at the time. I had 2 years of smartwatch data, and we looked over it, and there were 4 times I was ill during that time. And one was the Lyme I mentioned. There were 2 viral infections here and here. And this one was a big deal. It turns out I had high CRP. You can tell I sampled myself a lot, but I was asymptomatic. And so I just happened to pick that up. And it turns out every single time I had high C-reactive protein, a sign of illness, once you know it, I had high heart rate and high skin temperature. So that prompted us to write an algorithm called change of heart that measures your baseline heart rate, resting heart rate. This is, I should emphasize, resting heart rate. We measure your resting heart rate on an hour-by-hour basis. And then if we see a jump up over your normal background, it'll give a signal. So this is kind of a sliding window. We call it a delta plot. And so what'll happen is these are the 4 times I was ill. Every single time I was ill, this is all retrospective, we could see this jump up in resting heart rate in advance of symptoms, which is the red line. And it worked on me, it worked on 3 other people, one of whom got sick twice. Every single time we could see this jump up in heart rate, again, before symptoms in pretty much all cases. So as you might imagine, we were improving this. We published this actually 4 years ago, and we were improving our algorithms and actually trying to build this infrastructure when, of course, the pandemic hit. And so we had an infectious disease study running. IRB said you have to launch a new one because it's COVID. I don't know why, but we did. Anyway, we listened to our IRB, and we partnered with Fitbit, Garmin, and very quickly launched a study and got about 5,300 initially people to enroll, and 32 are what I would call golden data sets. They were people wearing the smartwatch, in this case Fitbit we started with. So they were wearing the smartwatch while they were ill. They had a diagnosis date and a symptom date. And so we could see what was going on when they were ill. And this is actually our very first person who enrolled in the study. This is resting heart rate. It's kind of a Z-score for those of you who follow this sort of thing over background. So here's the diagnosis date of this person. Here's the symptom date. And look when their resting heart rate jumped up. It jumped up here 9.5 days before symptoms. So presumably this person's been running around for 9.5 days ill and not knowing it. And then I'll show you in a minute, we have an alarming algorithm that can actually tell when it first jumps up. So it worked on him. It turns out it works on on the first 26, worked on 26 of 32 patients. So it didn't work on everyone, worked on 81% of people. And we know why it missed on 6 people. Well, we couldn't get a stable baseline. 3 had severe asthma, so we could never get a proper baseline. And so we couldn't see this elevation over the baseline. We have several algorithms for detecting this sort of thing. And it turns out then from this first group of people, it turns out we could detect it again, 81% of the time, and a median of 4 days prior to symptoms. And for some people, it's quite early. And so it was 4 days before symptoms, 7 days before diagnosis. And it's not specific for COVID. Other illnesses will trigger this as expected from what I told you earlier. It turns out in those cases, it's a median of 2 days prior to symptoms. And that makes sense because COVID has a longer pre-symptomatic period. And so it's not a huge jump up. On average, it's about 7 beats a minute. For some people, it's as little as 2 beats a minute. But you can pick that up because you're measuring people 24/7. So you can see this elevation when you're taking hundreds of thousands of measurements on folks. So this is a complicated slide, but you can make some correlation between symptoms and people's heart rate. It's a little bit tricky. It's not perfect by any means. So in parallel with this, then we wrote a real-time detection method for trying to follow when people are first getting ill. Now you can obviously tune this to whatever sensitivity you want. We tuned it so the alarms go off roughly every 2 months or so, which gives reasonable sensitivity and not too many false positives, number we think people can handle. So the way this works is we figure out people's baseline from 28 days of data, and then measure them on an hour-by-hour basis and calculate a jump up over baseline. And when they have a long enough statistically significant increase over their baseline, something that, again, would be very unusual, we send off an alarm. And so retrospectively, it works pretty well. It works in about 2/3 of cases. So here's a case here. I think this one's also 9 days, like the one I showed you, symptom date, diagnosis date there. There's a second person. I think this one's 7 days early. There are other alarms that go off. These are real increases of resting heart rate. Turns out 4 of 7 people have what we call a holiday bump. We know that alcohol, actually travel, extensive travel can trigger this. High altitudes will trigger it. So again, and stress will trigger it. Doesn't have to just be an infectious disease. So this could be in-law stress, alcohol. It's not really clear what triggers these, but again, these are real. So you do have to contextualize these alarms. If you've been drinking a lot and the alarm goes off, well, you probably have a pretty good explanation. So here's another illness that picked up, and here's a healthy person. And again, you do get alarms. Maybe that's an asymptomatic infection, not clear. Could be any of the other things I said. So I will tell you that the alarms go off. There are lasting signals of COVID. The COVID alarms, first of all, are stronger than other illnesses. We can show that this is duration, but we can show it by, here's alarm peak height. The COVID ones tend to be, again, more stronger signals than other illnesses. And not only that, we'll actually see more alarms going off after a COVID infection than before, suggesting there are some lingering effects in the immediate time after COVID. All right, so we've written a dashboard to pull in all this information, after tuning our algorithms, get everything right, we got IRB approval to launch the second phase of the study. So beginning of December, we set this up now as a real-time detection. I'd love to have all you guys sign up. Here it is. Go to innovations.stanford.edu/wearables and sign up for our study. And here's the system we built. It's actually, we're trying to roll this out to 10 million people, believe it or not. We've set up a system that can read all these measurements in real time and ping people back. And for the moment, the way the system works will alert you if your heart rate jumps up again over this background. And we'd like you to fill in what's going on. If you have gotten ill, then you should say that. If you've been drinking, say that. And if you don't know, just say that. So the point out of all this is we're trying to scale this to millions of people. And it turns out it does work. We launched this thing beginning of December, and I'll show you the numbers in a minute. And this was a good example where an alarm went off on this day, and the person had symptoms, I think it's 5 days later, 6 days later, and then got tested, and sure enough, they were positive after that. So it really does work. And from the first, well, here's where at the end of January, the numbers are higher now, but from the first 63 positive cases, we could detect a signal either before or at the day of symptoms in 44 of those cases. So it's a 70% success. We want to pull in more advanced data. The problem is we're really having trouble getting data, the high resolution data from the companies like we want. But even at this crude form, we can get positive detection 70% of the time. I know we can get better with more data. And so we're trying other things. So we published this first paper showing we could do all this back in November. Similar paper, well, more around just can you detect COVID from Stephen Steinhubble and Eric Topol's group was published around the same time with Fitbit. And we know now it works beyond Fitbit. Other studies were published with Oura Ring. There's one out there from Mount Sinai with Apple Watch. And I forgot to say the study we're running now with our new improved algorithms works on Fitbit, Apple Watch, Garmin, and we're just getting set up for a Samsung. So it'd be fantastic to have any of you who are wearing smartwatches to come join our study. You do have to just, all you do is download the app and you'll be able to see if symptoms are coming on. So here's the summary. Basically, we can pick up COVID with the smartwatch because of alterations. I didn't show you, but you actually tend to take fewer steps when you get ill and don't sleep so well. But you sleep longer, but not as well. And so we can pick up COVID with about 81% detection rate. This is now 70%. Our real-time detection system works about 70% of the time. And we've set up a system to scale to millions of people, and that's our goal. We want to actually do this for the entire planet. That's the plan. And here's a team that did it. This work was really started by Xiao Li and Jesse Dunn. And then with the COVID arrival, we've just very, very quickly scaled up and put together a team that could actually do this well at scale. And so that's the story I wanted to tell you. And I should have saved plenty of time for questions. So happy to take them if you have any.
Thank you, Michael. I'm looking at my Fitbit and wondering
what your heart rate is, yeah.
Scared.
Well, no, see, it could be a green, in which case you don't have to be scared. If it's red, well.
So I do have a quick question, and then we have some audience questions maybe. What's the false positive rate of alarm in this case if you sort of negate the effects of alcohol, altitude, and stress?
Yeah, about right now we're still cataloging all that, and so I'll quantify it more precisely, but about half the time we're seeing signals we haven't identified, meaning they're not due to something obvious. So yeah, and then the other half time they do correspond. Now obviously most of our folks aren't getting COVID. So they're not getting COVID every 2 months. So most of the alarms are false positives, but yeah. And as I say, we can tune for advanced, even earlier detection. We now wait about, it's about 24 hours before an alarm will go off. We could make it for 12 hours, but then you get more false alarms. So the sensitivity you can tune. But getting at your question, yeah, there's stuff going on we can't detect. Now, whether some of that is stress that people haven't cited or whether it's another asymptomatic infection, it's not clear.
Okay. Rodney Rothstein has a question. Rodney, you should be able to talk.
Hey, Mike. First, I wanted to say hello. Great talk. I very much enjoyed it. And I was going to ask a similar question to what Eric just asked, but I'm going to ask you another question first, and that's about the number of people that you have that are basically, have you enrolled people that are getting, quote, a PCR test all the time so that you can actually follow when the virus titer starts to show up? That seems like that might be interesting. And of course, it might be really interesting to look across 29 different viruses rather than just SARS-CoV-2. So that's my first question.
Yeah, so with that, the answer is yes. We're running a study with Empatica right now. As you might imagine, that gets very expensive because you're testing people every day. And we're trying to find people who are at risk. And of course, since you put these watches on people who are at risk, they never seem to get ill. So, so anyway, we're testing these folks every day. I forgot to say, but we did pick up 3 asymptomatic cases in the sense that they showed positive and they never reported having symptoms. And we'll see a very nearby alarm going off just before that for several days. So we think it, but so we think it does work for asymptomatic cases as well. But
And then,
the timing issue, I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head. We're trying to put it on folks, like you say, the NBA players get tested every day. There's another group, there'll be an announcement out of another group that gets tested pretty much every day too, that we're going to try and get the watches on.
yeah, that would be great. And then the other thing is, it's kind of related to what Eric was asking. So what are people supposed to do when they get an alert? And if 50% of the time it doesn't mean anything, or I shouldn't say it doesn't mean anything, it probably means something that we don't know much about. I mean, does that mean everybody's supposed to go into isolation for 7 days? And it does seem to present a problem.
Well, an obvious thing to do would be to use this in conjunction. So A, yes, you might do that. B, you might just go get tested, right? And see whether it's a false positive or not. The alarms are going off once every 2 months, as I say, the way we've tuned it right now. So I don't think that's too cumbersome. But I would argue if you're in an area where you're working close proximity with a lot of people, I think you want some sort of real-time monitoring, in my opinion, not once a week monitoring.
Yeah, well,
Amazon and places like that, because by the time those guys say they're positive, it's already spread like wildfire, right? It's already hit.
No, that's why I was asking the question.
Yeah,
All right,
so,
thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Michael, if I could ask, does the quality of the wearable make a difference in the quality of the data that you're obtaining?
The
Without,
answer is,
plugging any particular watch, I guess.
so the answer is, I'm sure it does. But we haven't, we're now comparing, like people like me wear 4 of these things. I got vaccinated, as you might imagine, an alarm did go off on my second shot. Like a lot of people, I got ill for a day. And my alarm, an alarm went off during that time. So what I haven't done is the comparison of, all the different devices to see, did they all trigger that alarm or not? So I think resolution does count for a lot. And there's other factors that are involved. Some watches, and I guess I can give you the pros and cons. Fit is rather low resolution, but people, the charge lasts 5 days. So people are always wearing it, which is nice. A lot of people charge the Apple Watch overnight, and you're going to lose one of your best health monitoring times. So if you are wearing an Apple Watch, try and leave it on overnight. Charge it some other time so you can get better health monitoring, I would say. Yeah, so those are factors that weigh into people's decision. Convenience, resolution. But I think, a lot of them don't do skin temperature. Skin temperature is of some value to COVID. By the way, you may realize, right? You walk up to a door. Have any of you ever been refused entry from one of those infrared things? No. Why not? Because everybody's temperature bounces all over, and temperature is a terrible measure of COVID. And people are still sticking thermometers in people's mouths. So talking about a terrible way to be trying to see if someone's ill. I guarantee resting heart rate is a much, much more sensitive measure. Your heart rate jumps up and it stays up when you get ill. So we're measuring the wrong things because, we're using 300-year-old technology to try and figure out in a 21st century pandemic. To me, it's just crazy. So anyway, a little editorializing going on there.
We have a question from Stephanie Holmquist. Stephanie, you should be able to talk.
Yeah, I'm just unmuted myself. I wanted to go a bit further. My question was about compliance and time of day wear versus recharging. Are you recommending then to your study participants that they recharge at a standard time of day, or asking them to limit recharging to some temporal window?
No, I just want them to make sure if they're wearing an Apple Watch, you don't charge it overnight. Our way to scale to 10 million, it'll break the bank if we run it in the hour by hour basis for 10 million people. But we now can pull off a signal from people at night which is relatively low cost. I'm a believer we could literally put a smartwatch on. Basically, right now, 60% of the world has a smartphone. You may know that, including Africa. If we put a smartwatch, $100 smartwatch on all of them, we'd have a health monitor on whatever that is. It's about 4 billion people, something like that. So
Thanks very much.
That's my goal. And I want them all to then just make sure they wear it at night so we can sense them at that time.
There are a couple questions in the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and read them since we have some time. First comes from John Riley, and if I'm asking the question correctly, it's are you looking at heart anomalies or the possibility of heart anomalies post COVID-19 infection?
Yeah, we're very interested. We know minimally, so the resting heart rate and heart rate variability is off. We're trying to look at that in a lot more detail. And then I'd love to correlate it with people who wind up with cardiac issues and see how the wearable matches the physician monitored parameters.
Okay, and the next question comes from Naomi Klickstein, and she's asking, are you looking at other heart-related data such as sleep duration, or are you looking at data in addition to heart related data such as sleep duration, exercise frequency, and so on, and relating them to the COVID related data?
We are, yeah. So we're trying to bring in all those data. It depends on the device. Everything contributes signal. We think resting heart rate for the way we're doing it right now is one of the stronger signals, and we have some deep learning going on to bring this together. The hardest part, and this is probably not surprising, is that companies don't share their high resolution data. They'll share their daily data or their low resolution data, or whatever that you can do through HealthKit. And we want, in an ideal world, we want much higher resolution data than that, so that we can really, again, follow people's respiration rates and things that, yeah, just better than what they're sharing. So, and here I'm totally conflicted. So in responses, we formed our own company that's making watches that's not meant to read your email or, answer phones or anything like that. It's really meant to measure physiology as accurately as possible. So that's what we're using now for some folks, testing it out, but it should let us pull in high resolution data, first of all, without going to the company, even my company. It can go right to an academic lab and pull in data that is high resolution. And yeah, you could then follow things, we hope, and we'll do deep learning to see, and if we can figure out which parameters are most valuable. With deep learning, you can't always do that. But that's the goal, to see which features contribute what signal. And again, I know they're going to vary from person to person because of how stable your baselines get for these different parameters. So people are variable in different ways on different physiological parameters. And so that makes that's all the more reason why you really need to personalize this whole thing, because you got to get people's baselines for each parameter and then sum a signal over that, if that makes sense.